The operating room was silent except for the steady rhythm of monitors, until Dr. Raymond Coller's voice cut through it like a blade. "Step back. You're a nurse. You don't make calls in here." She had just spotted something on the ultrasound image that nobody else in that room had caught. A shadow, small, but wrong. The kind of wrong that killed people in the next 40 minutes if nobody moved. She moved anyway. And for that, Nora Voss was stripped of her position, publicly humiliated in front of 12 colleagues, and transferred to a floor where the chief of surgery believed she could do no further damage to his ego. Nobody in that hospital knew what she had survived before she ever put on those scrubs. If this story already has your attention, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, follow along so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Nora Voss saved a man's life and lost her job happened on a Tuesday in March, which was the kind of detail that didn't matter at all until later, when people started looking back and trying to make sense of everything. Hargrove Memorial Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Crestfield, Ohio, a mid-sized city that prided itself on the kind of civic earnestness that showed up in murals painted on downtown buildings, and a mayor who attended high school football games. The hospital itself was newer than it looked. The brick facade and the wide stone steps gave it the appearance of something built in the 1950s, solid and deliberate, but most of the interior had been renovated in the last decade. The trauma center on the ground floor was considered one of the better units in the region. Not the best. The people who worked there knew the difference, even if the hospital's brochures didn't mention it. Nora Voss had worked the trauma floor for 4 years. She arrived every shift at least 15 minutes early. Not because anyone told her to, not because it earned her anything, but because 15 minutes gave her time to walk the floor without the noise. She checked the supply cabinets herself before each shift started. She memorized which machines had been acting temperamental. She read through the notes from the outgoing nurses and found the 2 or 3 things that didn't quite add up and then asked about them quietly before anything became a problem. Her colleagues had different ways of describing her, depending on who you asked. The nurses who had worked with her longest said she was steady. The word came up more than once, usually from people who had been beside her during something difficult. A crash, a bleed that didn't stop. A patient who coded at the worst possible moment. Steady was the word they used when they meant that she didn't change when things got bad. Her voice didn't climb, her hands didn't shake, she just kept working. The newer nurses sometimes mistook her quiet for coldness. She didn't make easy conversation. She didn't linger in the break room telling stories. She wasn't unkind, but she also wasn't warm in the way some people expected. When she smiled, it reached her eyes, but she didn't smile often. And she didn't explain herself to people who hadn't earned an explanation. The attending physicians had a more complicated relationship with her. Most of them respected her competence in the way that people respect something useful, without ever fully seeing it. A few of them actively liked her and had told her so. And Dr. Raymond Coller, chief of trauma surgery at Hargrove Memorial, tolerated her in the specific way that powerful men tolerate women who are better at something than they want them to be. Coller was 53. He had been at Hargrove for 11 years and had arrived carrying a reputation built at a larger hospital in Cleveland. He was technically skilled. That was never the question. In the operating room, his hands were precise and his decisions were fast, and he knew it. The problem with knowing something like that about yourself was that it left very little room for anything else, for anyone else. The morning of the Tuesday in March, Coller was operating on a 47-year-old man named Dale Pruitt, who had come in the previous night with blunt abdominal trauma from a vehicle collision. The surgery was going the way Coller had planned it. He had repaired the splenic laceration, controlled the bleeding, and was moving through the procedure with the unhurried confidence of a man who had done this specific surgery more times than he had counted. Nora was circulating. Her job in that room was to manage supplies, anticipate needs, keep the workflow moving without interruption. She was not the scrub tech. She was not the first assist. She was, according to the organizational hierarchy that Coller had spent a decade quietly reinforcing, support staff. She noticed the image at 7:14 in the morning. The ultrasound monitor was running on a secondary screen at the edge of her visual field, cycling through routine imaging. She wasn't supposed to be watching it closely, But she had spent the last several years watching things closely that other people watched loosely, and when something in her peripheral vision changed, some part of her mind flagged it before she consciously registered why. She looked at the screen. The image showed the upper right quadrant of Dale Pruitt's abdomen. There was a shadow near the hepatic flexure, small, irregular, not where it should have been. The kind of thing that could be artifact, the kind of thing that often was artifact. But it was moving in a way that artifact didn't move, and there was a density behind it that didn't read as tissue. And Nora had seen enough imaging in enough urgent situations to understand the difference between something dismissible and something that was going to become a catastrophic problem inside the next hour. She crossed the room to the imaging monitor without asking for permission, because permission would have taken time she didn't have. "Dr. Collar." He didn't look up. "What?" "I need you to look at this image." She kept her voice level. Not urgent, not demanding. Just the particular flatness she had learned to use when urgency needed to travel fast without triggering defensiveness. "Nora, I'm in the middle of a procedure." "I know. There's something on the hepatic imaging that I think warrants a look before you close." Collar's first assist, a third-year resident named Marcus Fielder, glanced briefly at the screen and then back at Collar. He said nothing. Nobody in that room said anything when Collar was operating. That was a social law as well understood as any posted policy. Collar did not look at the screen. "You are a circulating nurse," he said, and his voice was precise and quiet in the way that loud voices don't need to be. "You are not a radiologist. You are not a surgical fellow. You are not qualified to interpret imaging during a procedure, and your job right now is to manage the field, not to redirect my attention." "I understand that," Nora said. "I'm asking you to take 20 seconds and look at this." The room held still. "Step back." Collar's eyes came up then, and they were the color of overcast sky and completely certain of themselves. "You're a nurse. You don't make calls in here." She took one breath. Then she looked at the image one more time, and everything she knew told her the same thing it had told her 30 seconds ago. And so she did something that she understood in real time was going to cost her. She didn't argue with him. She didn't raise her voice. She walked to the instrument tray, picked up the probe that had been sitting unused, and with a quietness that made it almost impossible to object to in the moment, she adjusted the imaging angle by approximately 4 degrees. The shadow resolved into something clearer. Marcus Fielder saw it first because he was closest to the screen. His eyes went to it and stayed there for 2 full seconds before he said anything, and when he spoke, his voice had the controlled carefulness of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at and exactly what it meant socially to say so. "Dr. Collar." A pause. I think there's a secondary bleed. Hepatic artery." Collar looked. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Then Collar moved, because whatever else he was a surgeon, and surgeons moved when they saw what he was now seeing, and the next 22 minutes were controlled chaos, controlled because everyone in that room was trained and the situation was now visible and manageable. And when it was over and Dale Pruitt's hepatic artery had been identified and repaired, and the OR was breathing again, nobody said out loud that Nora Voss had been the one who found it. Collar didn't say it. Marcus Fielder didn't say it because he understood his position. And Nora didn't say it because she didn't need to. The patient was alive. That had been the point. The conversation happened in the hallway outside the OR 30 minutes after Pruitt had been transferred to recovery. Nora was completing her post-procedure documentation at the nurse station when Collar came out of the locker room and walked toward her with the particular directness of someone who had been rehearsing something in their head. She saw him coming and kept writing. "You want to explain what that was?" he said. She finished the line she was writing before she answered. "I identified a complication and brought it to your attention. You touched imaging equipment during an active procedure without authorization. The imaging equipment was running. I adjusted the probe angle. You undermined my authority in front of my team." She looked up at that, not with anger, with something quieter and more durable than anger. "Dr. Collar, your patient's hepatic artery was bleeding. I adjusted an angle on a monitor. I'm not discussing the clinical outcome." His voice was controlled, but the control was visible, like scaffolding. "I'm telling you that you overstepped your role in a way that is not acceptable in my OR, and it will not happen again. Okay, she said. He seemed to have expected more than that. A defense, maybe. A counter-argument. Something he could push back against. The simple quiet of her agreement seemed to irritate him more than resistance would have. I'm submitting an incident report, he said. She nodded. That's your call to make. He looked at her for a moment longer, as if waiting for something to shift in her expression. Nothing shifted. Then he walked away. The charge nurse for the day, Elaine Park, had been close enough to hear the exchange. She didn't say anything to Nora directly, but later, in the break room, Nora overheard her telling someone that Caller had gone straight to the department head's office, that the report was already written, that words like insubordination and overstepping had been used. Nora poured her coffee, listened to the edges of it, and went back to work. Ooh. The official notification came the following morning. It was delivered by the department supervisor, a man named Glenn Tartaglia, who had the uncomfortable energy of someone delivering a message he privately disagreed with, but had no intention of saying so. He sat across from Nora in his office, with the paper on the desk between them, and summarized its contents in the careful language of someone who had been coached. She was being transferred. Effective the following Monday. From the trauma unit to General Medical Floor 4C, which was a floor that handled post-surgical recovery and chronic care management, and did not see the kind of cases that Nora had spent 4 years building her skills around. Is there an appeals process? She asked. Glenn looked at the paper rather than at her. There's a 30-day review period. I'll submit a statement. You can do that. He still wasn't quite meeting her eyes. Nora, for what it's worth, it's okay, Glenn. She said it without bitterness, just clean and direct. I understand the situation. She signed the acknowledgement form and left his office. In the hallway, she stood for a moment outside his door. The morning light was coming through the window at the far end of the corridor in that particular way that hospital mornings sometimes have. Flat and institutional, and somehow still carrying something that was almost like hope if you were in the right mood to see it. She wasn't especially in that mood, but she noticed it anyway. She was 38 years old. She had survived things that this hallway, this hospital, this city could not imagine. A transfer to 4C was not the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. She walked to the elevator and pushed the button and went back to work. The rumors spread the way rumors spread in places where people work closely together in high-pressure conditions and therefore understand instinctively that information is a kind of currency. By the afternoon of the first day, it was known that Nora had been transferred. By the second day, the story had acquired details she hadn't contributed. Some people said she had argued with Caller in the OR. Some people said she had touched a surgical patient without authorization. By the end of the week, there was a version circulating that she had made a clinical error that Caller had quietly corrected, which was not only untrue but was almost precisely the opposite of true. And Nora listened to fragments of these accounts the way you listen to weather, noting it, tracking it, making no attempt to redirect it. She did not defend herself. This struck some of her former co-workers as strange, and struck others as confirmation of guilt, and she understood both reactions and found neither of them interesting. What she found interesting, in the way that you notice things when you are paying attention to the actual texture of a situation rather than its social surface, was that her new floor was not what she had expected. 4C was understaffed, not dramatically, not in a way that showed up clearly on a staffing report, but in the real operational sense that there were not enough experienced hands for the patient load that came through on any given day. The nurses were competent, they were working hard, but there were gaps, and the gaps were of the kind that didn't look dangerous until they suddenly were. On her third day on the floor, she caught a medication error. The patient was a 61-year-old woman named Sandra, who had come out of a hip replacement 2 days earlier and was on a blood pressure management protocol. Someone, it wasn't clear who, and Nora made a point of not making it clear, had entered the wrong dosage into the medication management system. The error was small enough that it might have passed through 2 more checkpoints before anyone noticed. Or it might not have been noticed until Sandra was in the kind of distress that required an emergency response. Nora noticed it during the medication reconciliation check that she had started doing as a matter of personal habit, not because it was assigned to her on 4C, but because she did it anyway. She corrected the dosage, flagged it through the appropriate system, and documented it the way documentation was supposed to be done. She didn't tell Sandra what had almost happened. She told Sandra that she was adjusting her afternoon medications based on the morning's numbers, which was true in the important sense, and Sandra thanked her and asked her what part of Ohio she was from. And they talked for a few minutes about Crestfield, which Nora had lived in for 4 years without becoming deeply attached to. When she left Sandra's room, her supervisor on 4C, a woman named Diane Osei, who had been running the floor for 6 years and who had formed her initial opinion of Nora cautiously and then steadily revised it, stopped her near the nurse's station. "You caught the Haverford dosing issue," Diane said. "It was in the chart. It was buried in the chart." A pause. "You've been here 3 days." Nora didn't have anything to say to that. "Where did you train?" Diane asked. It was the question Nora always navigated carefully, not because the official answer was false. She had trained at a very good nursing program, had her certifications, had her continuing education, but because the official answer was incomplete in ways she had spent years deciding not to explain. "Army nursing program," she said, "then civilian transition." Diane looked at her with the expression of someone filing information in a more prominent place. "How long were you in?" 8 years. A brief pause. "My brother did 3 tours, Marines." Diane's expression shifted slightly, not to softness exactly, but to recognition. "Okay, good catch." She walked back to the station, and Nora went on with her shift. Barzik. The day that changed things happened in Nora's second week on 4C. It started as an ordinary morning, which was to say that it was busy in the particular low-level way that general recovery floors are always busy. Never the spikes and crises of trauma, but a constant management of discomfort and complication, and the grinding work of helping bodies recover from things that had been done to them in operating rooms. There was a patient in room 412 named Douglas Herrera, 55, who had come in 4 days earlier with what had been diagnosed as a routine gallbladder surgery, and who had not been recovering the way routine gallbladder patients recovered. He was running a low fever. His pain levels were inconsistent in a way that didn't track with his medication schedule. He was anxious in a way that Douglas's daughter, who had been sitting with him every day, described as unusual for her father, who was normally stoic. Nora had been monitoring him with more attention than the assigned care plan strictly required. The attending physician for Douglas's case was a hospitalist named Dr. Patricia Sue, who was competent and overextended in the way that hospitalists at mid-sized regional hospitals are often overextended, managing too many patients across too many floors to give any single case the kind of sustained attention that would catch the things that were quiet before they got loud. At 9:40 in the morning, Douglas Herrera's daughter, a woman in her late 20s named Camille, came to the nurse's station and asked to speak with whoever was responsible for her father's care. Nora was the one who answered. Camille was trying to hold herself together in the way that people hold themselves together when they are genuinely frightened and don't want to be seen as difficult. "He's different this morning," she said. "I know doctors see a lot of patients, and I don't want to be... I'm not trying to be that person, but he's different. He's not responding to me the same way." Nora looked at her for a moment, then said, "Walk me back in." She spent the next 8 minutes with Douglas Herrera. She took his vitals. She checked his abdomen manually, gently, noting where he flinched and where he didn't. She looked at his eyes and his color and his breathing pattern. She asked him 4 questions about his pain and listened to the way he answered as much as to the answers themselves. Then she went to the nurse's station and paged Dr. Sue. "I have a patient on 4C showing signs that I think warrant imaging review," she said when Sue answered. "Douglas Herrera in 412, post-cholecystectomy day 4. His abdomen presentation is inconsistent with standard recovery, and his mental status is subtly altered. I think we need to consider a retained surgical complication." A brief pause on Sue's end. "His chart shows a normal post-op course." "His chart doesn't show what I'm seeing right now." She kept her voice completely neutral. "I'm not making a diagnosis. I'm telling you that something changed since yesterday, and I'd like you to come look at him." Another pause, shorter. "I'll be down in 20 minutes." It took Sue 15. She walked into Douglas Herrera's room with the slightly braced expression of someone expecting to spend time reassuring an anxious family member, and she came out 20 minutes later with her phone already to her ear, ordering a CT of the abdomen. The scan showed a retained bile duct stone causing early obstruction and the beginning of a bile leak, a complication that, if it had progressed through the afternoon without intervention, would have had Douglas in a far more serious situation before the end of the day. He was taken back to the OR that afternoon for a corrective procedure. He was recovering well by evening. Camille Herrera found Nora at the nurse's station at the end of the shift. "I heard what you did," she said. The doctor explained. "Your father is going to be fine," Nora said. "That's what matters." Camille looked at her with the particular helpless gratitude of someone who had almost lost something important and knew it. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "How did you know?" "He didn't look that different to me. I mean, I knew something was wrong. I felt it, but I didn't know what I was seeing." Nora considered the question honestly. "You knew," she said. "You're the reason I went in there. You came and told me something was wrong, and you were right." "But how did you know what it was?" A brief pause. "Experience," Nora said, "and paying attention to the things that don't quite fit." She gathered her materials and clocked out, and she walked to her car in the parking structure in the early March dark, and she sat for a moment before starting the engine, and she was not thinking about recognition or credit or any of the things that the story of the day would be told as being about. She was thinking about Douglas Herrera's face when he'd looked up at her that morning, the way he'd tried to smile and the effort it had cost him, the way Camille had stood beside the bed with her hand on her father's arm. That was the part that stayed with her. It always was. The incident report landed on Glenn Tartaglia's desk the following day. Not the one that had transferred Nora, but a new one. A positive one, submitted jointly by Dr. Patricia Sue and the nursing director for 4C, Diane Osei, documenting Nora Voss's clinical intervention in the Herrera case and recommending her for a commendation. Glenn read it twice. He was not an especially complicated man, but he understood a few things about how institutions worked, and one of them was that 2 positive documentation entries within 12 days of a disciplinary action created a kind of paper friction that made the disciplinary action uncomfortable to look at directly. He filed the commendation and did not tell anyone about the discomfort. What he didn't know, what almost no one at Hargrove Memorial knew, was that the documentation currently sitting in Nora Voss's personnel file, the thin and ordinary-looking folder that held her nursing credentials and her transfer paperwork, and now the Herrera commendation, was only part of the record that existed on her. The rest of it was in a different kind of file, the kind that had a classification level, the kind that certain federal agencies and a specific branch of the U.S. military maintained on individuals who had done things that could not be acknowledged in ordinary personnel systems. Nora Voss had filled out the paperwork for her civilian nursing license 7 years ago under her given name. She had listed her military service accurately, in the flat and factual way that the form required, 8 years, medical corps, honorable discharge, without mentioning that the last 3 years of that service had not involved anything that appeared in the standard record. There were people who knew the full version of what those 3 years had looked like. Not many. 12 of them were alive specifically because of what she had done during one particular mission in a country that the official record of that mission did not name. One of those 12 people had reached a level of seniority in the U.S. military that placed him in rooms where decisions were made about programs that almost never made the news. He had been looking for her for 6 weeks. He had found her 11 days ago. He had made a phone call. The phone call had initiated a process that was moving through channels at a speed that bureaucracies moved when the right person was applying the right pressure, and the process was 3 days from arriving at its destination, which was a hospital in Crestfield, Ohio. Nora didn't know about the phone call. She was on the overnight shift on 4C when her old military-issue phone, the one she kept charged in the bottom drawer of her bedside table at home, the one she had not used in 4 years, lit up with a message that read only, "Heads up, incoming. T." She read it once. Then she set the phone face down on her kitchen counter and stood in her kitchen in the dark for a moment, and her expression was the expression of someone for whom a door they had carefully closed a long time ago had just been knocked on from the other side. She went to work. She said nothing to anyone, but 3 days later, when she arrived for her morning shift on 4C and found Diane Osei standing at the entrance of the floor with an expression that Nora had never seen on her face before, something between bewilderment and the particular alertness of a person in the presence of something they don't have a category for, Nora already knew what Diane was going to say before she said it. "There are people downstairs asking for you," Diane said. "Military people. Nora, one of them has 4 stars on his collar." Nora set her bag down at the nurse's station with the same steadiness with which she did everything. "Tell them I'll be right down," she said. She took the stairs. Not because the elevator was slow, there were 3 of them and they moved fine, but because the stairs gave her 45 seconds that the elevator didn't, and 45 seconds was enough to do what she needed to do, which was nothing visible, nothing dramatic, just a particular internal adjustment that she had learned to make a long time ago in conditions that made a hospital stairwell look like a vacation. She came through the ground floor door and into the main corridor, and she saw them immediately. There were 4 of them. 2 in Army service uniforms, standing with the particular stillness of people trained to occupy space without drawing attention to themselves, and failing at it completely, because that kind of stillness in a hospital lobby drew attention whether you wanted it to or not. A 3rd in civilian clothes, a woman in her 40s with a government-issue posture and a leather folder under her arm. And the 4th, Brigadier General Thomas Aldrich. He was shorter than she remembered. People often were, when you met them again after years. He was 61 now, she calculated, or close to it, and his hair was fully white at the temples, and his face had the settled quality of a man who had stopped worrying about what people thought of him somewhere around his 55th year. He wore his uniform with the ease of someone who had been wearing it so long it no longer felt like clothing. He saw her come through the door, and something in his face shifted, not into warmth exactly, but into relief, which was a different and more honest thing. She crossed the lobby. He extended his hand and she shook it, and the handshake was the handshake of 2 people who had been through something that normal handshakes couldn't reference. "Voss," he said. "Sir?" "You look well." He studied her face the way people studied faces when they were checking for something specific. "You look like you've been sleeping." "Some. Better than me." He glanced around the lobby. The woman at reception who had stopped pretending to type. The 2 orderlies near the entrance who were doing a poor job of not staring. "Is there somewhere we can talk that isn't this?" There was a family consultation room off the main corridor that was empty on Tuesday mornings. She led them there. Bad. The civilian woman's name was Kira Dalton. She was with the Department of Defense, she said, and she said it the way people said things when the title was real, but incomplete, and Nora noted that and didn't ask follow-up questions. The 2 uniformed soldiers waited outside the room. Aldrich sat across from Nora at the small table and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at her the way he had always looked at people he was about to say something real to, directly, without the social cushioning that most people used. "We've been looking for you for a while," he said. "I know. T sent me a message." A flicker of something across his face. "Tillman? Of course he did. He's subtle that way. He's a pain in my neck is what he is. But there was something close to affection in it. How much do you know about what's coming?" "Nothing specific. That you were looking for me. That it was coming through official channels." Dalton opened the leather folder and slid a document across the table. Nora looked at it without touching it first. The header was Department of Defense. Below that, a program name she didn't recognize. Below that, her name, her service number, and a classification designation that she hadn't seen in 4 years. "The Meridian Program," Aldrich said. "Federal Emergency Medical Preparedness. We're building a training infrastructure for civilian hospitals. What to do when a mass casualty event exceeds local capacity. Real triage, real tactical medicine. The kind that doesn't get taught in nursing schools because nursing schools don't have the source material." "You want instructors," Nora said. "I want people who've actually done it, who've made the calls in the field and lived with the results." He leaned forward slightly. "There are 6 names on the short list for lead instructors. You're at the top." She looked at the document. "I'm a floor nurse on a recovery ward." "You're Sergeant Nora Voss. You're a combat medical badge recipient. You ran triage for 7 hours in the Cardon Valley with no extraction and 4 critically wounded, and you brought every one of them out alive. He said it without performance, just the flat precision of a man reciting facts that he had spent years not being able to say out loud in an official context. That's not a floor nurse. That's not even in the same category. The room was quiet. The hospital transferred me 2 weeks ago, she said. I know. Something moved across his face. Dalton briefed me on the situation here, the incident report, the surgeon. His jaw tightened briefly. I want to be clear that how you're being treated here has nothing to do with how the U.S. Army views your record. I know that too. Does it bother you? What's happened here? She thought about this honestly. Not the answer she was supposed to give, not the stoic non-answer, not the diplomatic deflection, the actual honest assessment. It bothered me, she said, for about a day. Then I went back to work. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, as if that answer had confirmed something he had been fairly sure of, but needed to hear. The program starts in 14 weeks, Dalton said, speaking for the first time since the introduction. Her voice was precise and measured. We're proposing a temporary assignment structure. You would retain your civilian employment status, but you'd be on loan to the Meridian program for an initial 18-month term. There's a federal compensation differential. There are implications for your civilian record that are, she glanced at Aldrich, uniformly positive. Nora looked at the document again. What does the hospital know? Currently, nothing beyond the fact that we're here. Dalton's expression was neutral. What they know from this point forward depends partly on how you want to handle it. And if I say no? The question landed in the room and stayed there. Aldrich met her eyes. Then you say no, and we find someone else on the list, and you go back upstairs. You're not being ordered. This is a request. He paused. A formal one, but a request. She folded her hands on the table. The truth was that she had known, when she read Tillman's message 3 days ago, that something like this was coming. She had known it the way you know things when you have learned to read the pattern of events, the tone of a message, the fact that he'd used the word incoming rather than anything else. She had spent 3 days not thinking about it directly, and thinking about almost nothing else. She looked at Thomas Aldrich, and she thought about the valley. She thought about what 7 hours looked like from the inside of it, not the version that got written into documents, but the actual texture, the specific decisions, the moments when the calculation was brutal and had to be made anyway, and then lived with. She thought about Douglas Herrera's face. She thought about what it meant to be good at one specific terrible thing, and whether that thing had a debt attached to it. I'm not saying yes today, she said. That's fine. I have patience. I understand that. And there's a situation here that isn't resolved yet. I'm not going to leave it half-finished. Aldrich studied her. What situation? She looked at him with the expression of someone who was not going to explain further. Give me a week. He glanced at Dalton. Something passed between them that Nora didn't try to read. Then he looked back at her. 1 week, he said. Dalton will be reachable. He slid a card across the table. One more thing. He stood, and she stood because it was the automatic response to watching someone like him stand. The record from the valley. The full account. He met her eyes. There are people in this building who don't know what you did. They've made certain assessments about who you are based on incomplete information. That happens. It bothers me. I know it does. She picked up Dalton's card. It doesn't bother me the same way it bothers you, sir. It should. Maybe. She moved toward the door. But I've been bothered by worse things. She went back upstairs. Diane was waiting at the edge of the nurses' station with the studied nonchalance of someone who had been waiting and was doing a moderate job of appearing not to have been. Everything okay? Diane asked. Fine, Nora said. Old Army connection, bureaucratic paperwork thing. Diane looked at her with the expression of someone who believed approximately 40% of that answer, but was too professional to push. You have 4 patients waiting. I know. She went to work. The story traveled. In hospitals, stories about unusual things traveled fast and transformed as they traveled, acquiring detail and losing accuracy at roughly equal rates. By noon, the version circulating on the trauma floor, which Nora was no longer assigned to but which remained the center of institutional gossip, was that military officials had come to the hospital looking for a nurse, that there had been some kind of classified situation, that the nurse in question had once done something in the Army that nobody was supposed to know about. The trauma floor's version had embellishments. The military officials had been escorted by security. There had been a closed meeting with hospital administration. The nurse, and by afternoon everyone knew it was Nora Voss because hospitals were constitutionally incapable of keeping that kind of information inside a single floor, had been offered some kind of government position. Raymond Collar heard the story at 1:15 in the afternoon in his office from his administrative assistant, who had heard it from someone in dietary, who had gotten it from a family member of a patient who had been in the lobby when the military officials arrived. He sat with it. He had spent 2 weeks being certain about Nora Voss, certain about what she was, a competent but overreaching nurse with poor judgment about the boundaries of her role, certain about what he had done, exercised appropriate authority in a situation that required it, certain that the transfer had been the correct administrative response to a clear professional violation. Certainty, in Collar's experience, was a thing that protected you from having to revisit decisions that were uncomfortable to revisit. He had built a great deal of his professional life on a particular architecture of certainty, and that architecture was generally quite sturdy. The story about the military officials was introducing a structural stress that he didn't have a category for. He told himself it didn't change anything. Whatever Nora Voss had done in the Army was irrelevant to what had happened in his OR. The two things were separate. The principle that a circulating nurse did not redirect surgical imaging during a procedure was not contingent on the nurse's personal history. He believed this. He was also aware, on some level below where he kept his beliefs, that he was working quite hard to continue believing it. The week moved. Nora worked her shifts. She managed 4 patients on 4C, then 6 as the staffing situation on the floor continued its quiet deterioration. She found 2 more charting inconsistencies, neither as urgent as the Herrera situation, both meaningful, and documented them through the proper channels without drawing attention to herself in the process. She called Tillman on Thursday. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting her call, which was annoying, and she told him so. "You could have given me more warning," she said. "I gave you 3 days." His voice was the same as she remembered it, unhurried, slightly amused, carrying the particular ease of someone who had been in enough bad situations to find most non-bad situations manageable. "That's more than you gave me in the valley, when you decided we were moving patients through the Eastern Passage instead of waiting for extraction. That was different. It was exactly the same. You made a call and didn't consult anyone. You were unconscious for approximately 20 minutes. Key 20 minutes. A pause. Are you going to take the program?" She leaned against the window in her apartment. Outside, the March evening was doing the thing it did in Ohio in March, unable to commit to being either winter or spring, defaulting to a gray neutrality that was somehow more depressing than either. "I don't know yet." "Nora, I know. It's a good program. Aldrich put real work into it, and the people on that list—" He stopped. "These are people who know how to teach the thing that can't be taught from a textbook. That's rare. I'm aware of that." "So what's the thing here? The hospital situation?" She didn't answer immediately. "The surgeon filed an incident report on me," she said. "My record here has a formal action on it that isn't accurate. That report says I overstepped my clinical role and disrupted a surgical procedure. The actual facts of what happened are that I caught a secondary bleed that nobody else caught, and the patient survived because of it. That's," he exhaled, "that's a fixable problem. Not on my own timeline. The 30-day review window closes next week. And if it closes with the report standing, then it's permanent, and it follows me to any future clinical position, including the Meridian program, where my credentialing will be reviewed in full." Silence on the line. "Does Aldrich know this?" "He knows there was a situation. He doesn't know the specifics of the documentation." Nora. A different kind of pause now. Why didn't you tell him? It was a fair question. She'd been asking it to herself intermittently for 4 days. Because I'm not going to use him to fix a problem that I should be able to fix through the right channels, she said. If the right channels work, that's what matters. And if they don't work, she stopped. If they don't work, then I'll figure out what happens next. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear faintly the sound of wherever he was, wind maybe, or an HVAC system, something ambient. You haven't changed, he said finally. Was I supposed to? No. A brief pause that carried more than what he'd said. Watch your back, Voss. Always. She hung up and stood at the window until the streetlights outside came on, one by one, in the deepening Ohio dark. The review board convened on the following Tuesday. It was not dramatic. These things never were on the surface. It took place in a conference room on the administrative floor with 5 people at the table. The department head for trauma surgery, the chief nursing officer, Glenn Tartaglia, a patient advocacy representative named Howard Pell, who had the expression of someone who attended a great many meetings and believed in their importance with moderate conviction, and Dr. Patricia Sue, who was present as a clinical witness because she had filed the Herrera commendation. Nora sat on one side of the table with the written statement she had submitted through the review process. 4 pages, precise, clinical, containing every relevant fact in chronological order with 0 embellishment and 0 editorial comment. Collar sat at the far end of the table. He had not been required to attend but had chosen to, and he held himself with the particular stiffness of someone who had not fully decided whether attending had been a good idea. The department head, a man named Dr. Andrew Fitch, who had been in his role for 3 years and who governed primarily through the avoidance of conflict, reviewed the incident report and Nora's counterstatement and the Herrera commendation and a brief clinical note submitted by Marcus Fielder, the third-year resident who had been in the OR, and who had written, in language so carefully passive that it was almost invisible as the thing it was, that the imaging adjustment performed by the circulating nurse had facilitated identification of a complication. Fitch read everything twice. Then he asked Collar to describe the incident from his perspective. Collar did. He was precise. He was measured. He used language like protocol deviation and scope of practice boundary and disruption of surgical workflow, and everything he said was technically accurate and framed in a way that made accurate things feel like something different from what they were. Then Fitch asked Nora. She told him what had happened. Plain sequence, no framing, the imaging data, the adjustment, the outcome. When she finished, Pell, the patient advocate, looked at his notes and said, "And the patient, Mr. Pruitt, he recovered fully?" "Yes," Nora said, "and the secondary bleed that was identified was a hepatic artery complication that, if unaddressed, would have resulted in significant blood loss and likely required emergency intervention within the hour." She kept her voice completely level. "That's documented in the operative notes." Pell looked at Fitch. Fitch looked at the table. "Dr. Collar," So said, she was the only other person in the room who had been in an OR in the last 48 hours, and her voice carried the authority of recent context. "In your clinical judgment, not your administrative judgment, was the patient at risk?" A beat. "The situation was managed," Collar said. "That's not what I asked." The room got very quiet. Collar looked at Sue, then he looked at the table. Then he said, with the precision of a man choosing every word with surgical care, "There was an identifiable complication that required intervention. And the intervention was initiated because of the imaging adjustment." Another beat, longer. "The imaging adjustment drew attention to it. Yes." Sue nodded once and wrote something in her notes. The review board deliberated for 22 minutes, which Nora spent in a waiting area outside the conference room, sitting in a chair with her hands in her lap, not doing anything in particular, just waiting with the patience of someone who had once spent 4 hours lying in a drainage ditch, waiting for conditions to change, and had learned something fundamental about the relationship between waiting and outcome. When Fitch came out, he had the expression of someone who had made a decision that was right but uncomfortable. "The board has voted to rescind the incident report," he said. The documentation in your personnel file will reflect that the review found the original action to be without merit. Thank you, Nora said. There will also be, he paused as if finding the words, an internal process review regarding the circumstances that led to the original action. She looked at him steadily. Meaning? Meaning Dr. Collar's case management and conduct documentation will be reviewed. He said it carefully, like someone who had been advised to say exactly that and no more. She nodded. I understand. She went back to 4C and what happened next happened in pieces, which was how institutional consequences almost always worked. Not in sudden dramatic reversals, but in the accumulation of small things that built toward something irreversible. The case management review of Raymond Collar's department was assigned to an outside auditor, a process that the hospital used when internal review created too many conflicts of interest. The auditor was a woman named Dr. Sandra Okai, who had spent 12 years doing this specific kind of work and who had the affect of someone permanently skeptical of the version of events that powerful people preferred. She spent the first 2 days reading files. What she found by the end of those 2 days was not simply the Nora Voss situation. What she found was a pattern. Incident reports filed against nurses and residents who had flagged concerns in Collar's OR, a consistent documentation practice that framed clinical observations as insubordination, 3 separate cases in the preceding 2 years where staff members had submitted concerns through internal channels and had subsequently been reassigned or pushed toward resignation. She found a resident who had left Hargrove Memorial 14 months ago and had submitted an exit interview that described the trauma OR culture in terms that the HR representative had summarized in their internal notes as significant but difficult to act on. She found 2 nurses who were still employed at Hargrove who had transferred off the trauma floor under circumstances that bore a noticeable structural resemblance to what had happened to Nora Voss. She compiled her preliminary findings and submitted them to the hospital's governing board, which was a different body from the department-level board that had reviewed Nora's case. And the governing board had relationships with legal counsel and liability assessment that the department-level board did not have. Within 48 hours, Collar had been placed on administrative leave pending a full governance review. He was told this on a Thursday afternoon, in the same conference room where Nora's review had taken place. And the fact that he sat in the same chair she had sat in did not occur to anyone as particularly meaningful, though it might have if anyone had been keeping track. Nora learned about the administrative leave from Diane Osei, who heard it from someone on the administrative floor who had seen Collar leave the conference room and who described his expression as something they had never seen on his face before. Nora was in the middle of writing a care plan update when Diane told her. She finished the line she was writing. Then she set down her pen and looked at the wall for a moment, and what she felt was not satisfaction, which was what people expected, and not vindication, which was what the story would later say she felt. What she actually felt was something quieter and more complicated, a kind of recognition that things had moved toward accuracy, that the record was now closer to true than it had been, and that this mattered in a way that was real, even if it was hard to name precisely. You knew this was coming, Diane said. It was not quite a question. I thought the audit would find more than just my case, Nora said. The pattern was there. Diane was quiet for a moment. How long has he been doing this? I don't know the full answer to that. The auditor has more information than I do. But you knew he'd done it before. Nora looked at her. I suspected it. The speed of the incident report, how fast the transfer paperwork moved. It felt practiced. She paused. People who do things like that for the first time are usually uncertain about it. He wasn't. Diane absorbed this. Why didn't you say that in the review? Because I couldn't prove it, and because my job was to get my own record straight, not to build a case against him. She picked up her pen. The auditor's job was to build the case. The charge on the floor went off, a call light in 4:08. Nora was already standing. Wait, Diane said. Nora, she paused. The military people, Diane said carefully. They're offering you something. Not a question either. They're offering me something, Nora confirmed. Are you going to take it? She looked at Diane, at the 6 years of work that lived in Diane's face, the competence and the exhaustion and the genuine care that Diane brought to a floor that was perpetually understaffed and under-resourced and that she had never abandoned. I don't know yet, she said. I need to think about what I'd be leaving. She went to answer the call light. She was halfway down the hall when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and looked at it without breaking stride. It was a number she didn't recognize. Ohio area code. She let it go to voicemail and kept walking. She didn't check the voicemail until her break at 3:15, standing in the small alcove near the stairwell where the building's noise was lowest. The message was from a woman who identified herself as belonging to the hospital governing board. Ms. Voss, the woman said, we would like to schedule a conversation with you at your earliest convenience. The board has some questions regarding your experience in the trauma department and, a brief pause, regarding your professional background more broadly. We've received some information from an external source that we believe warrants a direct conversation with you. The message ended. Nora stood in the alcove. An external source. She thought about Aldrich, about Dalton and the leather folder and the classification designation on the document she hadn't touched. She thought about what it meant that the governing board had received information from somewhere. And she thought about who had the access and the motivation to send it. And she thought about the specific phrasing, your professional background more broadly, and what that phrase was trying not to say directly. The stairwell door opened and a transport tech came through with an empty wheelchair, nodded at her, and moved on, and the door swung shut again, and the alcove was quiet. She looked at the phone for a long moment. Then she called the number back. It rang twice. This is Voss, she said when the woman answered. I can meet with the board tomorrow morning. Wonderful, the woman said. We've also been asked to inform you that General Aldrich has requested to attend the meeting in an advisory capacity, if you consent to that. The alcove was very quiet. He's already in Crestfield? Nora asked. He arrived this morning. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. Tell him he can attend, she said. She hung up and stood for a moment in the alcove, and then she heard from somewhere down the hall a call light going off, and she put the phone in her pocket and went back to work, because that was the thing. That was always the thing. The floor did not pause for the size of what was coming, and neither did she. The board meeting was scheduled for 8 in the morning, which meant Nora was at the hospital by 6:15. Not for the meeting, for her shift. She had 4 patients on 4C who needed morning assessments before she handed anything off, and she wasn't going to walk into a governing board meeting having left her floor coverage in a gap. Diane had arranged for one of the per diem nurses to cover at 7:30, and Nora used the 90 minutes before that the way she used most mornings, moving through rooms, checking vitals, listening to the things patients said and the things they didn't say, making notes. Room 408 had a new patient overnight. 68-year-old man named Walter Briggs, admitted for a post-cardiac catheterization complication, stable but anxious, in the particular way of men his age who had spent their lives managing their own health as a private matter and found hospitalization humiliating. He didn't want to talk about how he was feeling. He wanted to talk about when he could go home. Probably 2 more days, Nora told him. Maybe 1 if your numbers stay where they are this morning. My wife is doing everything herself, he said. We have a dog. The dog will be okay for 2 more days. She's not good with the dog. Mr. Briggs. She finished the blood pressure cuff and noted the number, which was better than yesterday. Your numbers look good this morning. I'll make sure Dr. Sue sees this before rounds. He looked at her with the guarded hopefulness of someone who had been in the hospital long enough to be suspicious of good news. You think she'll move up the discharge? I think it's worth asking her. He absorbed this. Then, after a moment, he said, You're the one who... I heard from the nurses. You're the one who found the problem with that other patient, the one who went back to surgery. She finished her notation. I just flagged something for the attending. That's not what I heard. She looked at him briefly. He had the expression of someone wanting to say something he wasn't sure how to say. Thank you, he said, for doing that. I know they don't make it easy, that kind of thing. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, Rest. I'll check back before I hand off. She went to the next room. Jeez. At 7:28, she removed her stethoscope, folded it into her bag, and handed the floor to the per diem nurse with a 3-minute verbal update that covered every patient by name, current status, and the two things that specifically needed watching. Then she took the elevator to the administrative floor, which she had been on exactly twice before in 4 years, and found the conference room by following the sound of voices that stopped when she opened the door. There were 8 people at the table. She identified them in approximately 3 seconds, the way she identified rooms, fast, sequenced, without appearing to do it. The governing board chair, a woman named Roberta Finch, who had the groomed composure of someone accustomed to running difficult meetings. 2 other board members she didn't know. The hospital's legal counsel, identifiable by the laptop and the particular quality of his stillness. Glenn Tartaglia, looking like he had slept badly. Dr. Andrew Fitch from the trauma department. Kira Dalton, the DoD civilian from the earlier meeting, sitting slightly apart from the hospital contingent with the leather folder in front of her again. And Thomas Aldrich, in uniform, at the far end of the table, who looked at Nora when she came in with the expression of someone who had been waiting with patience that cost him something. She sat in the empty chair across from Finch. "Ms. Voss," Finch said, "thank you for making time." "Of course." Finch looked at her notes. "This meeting has a somewhat unusual structure because we're addressing 2 related but distinct matters simultaneously. The first concerns the audit findings from the trauma department review. The second," she paused with the carefully managed neutrality of someone who had been briefed on something and was still integrating it. "The second concerns information provided to the board by General Aldrich's office, which has bearing on how we understand your record here and your overall professional background." "All right," Nora said. "Do you have any objection to addressing both matters in this setting?" "No?" Finch nodded at the legal counsel, who turned his laptop slightly toward the center of the table. Then she looked at Aldrich. "General, the board has reviewed the summary document your office submitted. I'd like to give you the opportunity to speak to it directly." Aldrich leaned forward. What he said in the next 7 minutes was the version of Nora's military record that could be said in a room with a DoD presence and a governing board and a legal counsel, which was not the full version, but was enough. He described her training, her years with the Army Medical Corps, her deployment history, in the terms that deployment history could be described without naming operations that remained classified. He described her combat medical badge, which was not given without specific documented performance under direct fire. He described the program she was being recruited for and why she was on the short list and what the short list looked like. The room was quiet throughout. Nora looked at the table. She had known this was coming, had consented to it, in effect, by agreeing to let Aldrich attend. But there was still something strange about sitting in a room while your own history was summarized for an audience, especially history that you had spent years keeping in a sealed part of your life. It wasn't embarrassing. It wasn't uncomfortable in the way people expected. It was more like watching someone open a box that you hadn't looked inside in a long time and being surprised by your own reaction to seeing the contents. When Aldrich finished, Finch looked at Nora. "Ms. Voss, is there anything you want to add to or correct in what the general described?" "No," she said. "Is there anything you want to say about the incident report and the transfer from the trauma department?" She thought about what Tillman had said on the phone. "You haven't changed." She thought about what she had said to Aldrich in the consultation room. "It doesn't bother me the same way it bothers you. Both of those things were true, and they were also not the complete truth, and she was done with incomplete versions of things. I want to say that the incident report was filed because Dr. Collar felt his authority had been challenged," she said. "Not because I made a clinical error. The review board found that. The audit is finding it more broadly." She kept her voice the same temperature it always was. "I did my job. A patient is alive because I did my job. The report said otherwise, and it was wrong." A brief pause. "That's what I want on record." Fitch, at the far end, shifted in his chair. Finch wrote something. "Noted." She looked up. "The board has reviewed the audit preliminary findings, which document a pattern of conduct in the trauma department that extends beyond your specific case. We are taking formal action regarding Dr. Collar's administrative standing effective today. That decision is not contingent on this meeting. It was made yesterday. But we wanted you to hear it from us directly." "I appreciate that," Nora said. The legal counsel said something quietly to Finch. She nodded. "There's one more matter," she said. "The board would like to make a formal statement of apology." For the record, for the circumstances of your transfer, and the professional impact of the incident report during the review period. The room was very still. Nora looked at Finch, at the precise formality of the apology, at the careful institutional language that surrounded it, at the 7 other people in the room who were witnessing it. "Thank you," she said, and then, because it was the true thing, "That matters." She was back on 4C by 9:45. She didn't tell Diane what had happened in the meeting. Diane didn't ask, which was one of the things Nora had come to respect about her. The ability to read when someone needed the space of a normal shift more than they needed a conversation. The floor was medium busy. 2 discharges were processing. A new admission was coming up from the ED, a 44-year-old woman post-appendectomy, straightforward presentation, but Nora flagged to keep an eye on her first-hour vitals, because something in the intake note read slightly off, a detail about the surgery duration that didn't match the clinical language. She was writing the monitoring note when her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, a different unknown number from the one that had called yesterday. 4 words. Check your email. Dalton. She finished the monitoring note, then pulled up her email on the workstation. There was a message from a DoD domain address. She opened it. It was brief, the kind of brief that meant someone had chosen every word. Ms. Voss, the Meridian program timeline has moved up. Initial cohort deployment is now 11 weeks, not 14. We need a decision by end of week. One additional piece of information you should have. The Cardin Valley operation is being formally declassified as of Q2. The record will be complete and public. This changes what we're asking you to carry alone. K. Dalton. She read it twice. Then she closed the email and sat for a moment at the workstation. The Cardin Valley. She had not said that name out loud in 4 years. It existed in her in the specific way that significant things exist when you have decided not to think about them directly. Present at the edge of everything, never quite going away, not exactly a wound, but not exactly healed either. 7 hours in a drainage system under fire. 4 soldiers. The calculation she had made at R3 when extraction had been pushed back a second time, and she had understood, with the clarity that extreme situations sometimes produced, that waiting was going to kill the 2 most critical patients before anyone came for them. The decision to move. The 40 minutes of moving that she did not let herself remember in sequential detail because the sequential detail was the part that had the most weight to it. Every one of them had made it out. She had never told anyone outside of the debrief room what the 40 minutes had actually looked like. The debrief had been classified. The records had been classified. And she had closed that box and gone to nursing school and come to Crestfield, Ohio, and put on scrubs and started over. This changes what we're asking you to carry alone. Dalton had chosen that phrasing carefully. Nora sat with it. She thought about Walter Briggs and his wife and the dog. She thought about Douglas Herrera's daughter standing at the nurses' station, trying not to fall apart. She thought about what it meant to be good at something that people in this building were only beginning to understand she was good at, and about what it meant that somewhere else there was a program being built that needed exactly what she knew, and about the 11 people who were still alive. 12, counting herself. She thought about staying. She thought about going. The new admission from the ED arrived at 10:22, and Nora put the phone away and went to receive her. The woman's name was Priya Agarwal, and she was 44, and she was in more pain than the post-appendectomy protocol accounted for. Nora noticed it within 4 minutes of the handoff from the transport team. Not the pain itself, post-surgical pain was expected and managed, but the character of it. Priya was holding herself in a way that suggested the pain had a location, and the location was slightly wrong for a standard appendectomy recovery. Her breathing was shallow in a way that wasn't just discomfort. She was also running a temperature of 100.4, which was at the edge of the acceptable post-surgical range, but climbing. Nora completed the intake assessment and went to the system to pull the OR notes. The surgery duration flag she'd caught in the intake note was confirmed. The appendectomy had taken 47 minutes, which was 11 minutes longer than the average for a laparoscopic procedure without complication. The OR notes listed the reason as adhesion management, which was a real thing and a legitimate reason, but it was also a phrase that could cover a range of situations. She paged the surgical resident on call, a second year named Dr. Ben Harlow. He arrived in 14 minutes, which was within acceptable response time, but on the slow end, and he had the slightly harried energy of someone managing 3 concurrent situations. Post-epi in 414, Nora said. 47-minute case with adhesion notation. She's febrile at 100.4 and climbing. Pain presentation is shifted slightly lateral from the surgical site. Harlow looked at the tablet. That's inside normal range for post-surgical fever. It's at the top of normal range and it's been trending up for 2 hours. She came out of the OR 3 hours ago. I know. He looked up at her. He was 27, she guessed, and he had the look of someone who was competent but not yet certain of his own competence, which was a state she generally found more trustworthy than its alternative. What are you thinking? I'm thinking a 47-minute case with adhesion management and a lateral pain shift and a climbing fever warrants a conversation with her attending. He held her gaze, not defensively, assessingly. I'll call Dr. Okafor, he said. Good. He stepped away to make the call. Nora went back into Priya's room. Priya was awake and looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone working hard to keep herself calm. Is something wrong? Priya asked when Nora came in. We're just being careful. Nora adjusted the monitoring leads. The doctor is going to call your surgeon, and we may want to take another look at some imaging. It's probably nothing that needs action, but we'd rather look now than wait. How long will that take? Depends on what we see. Maybe an hour. Priya closed her eyes. I have a presentation tomorrow. For work. Tell me what kind of work you do. It was a deliberate redirect, and Priya knew it was a redirect. And she went along with it anyway because the alternative was lying in a hospital bed thinking about fever and pain and imaging, which was worse. She was an environmental engineer. She talked about a water table assessment project for a municipal client in eastern Ohio. She talked about it for 6 minutes while Nora checked her dressing and her drain output and the color of the fluid, and by the end of 6 minutes the paging system had activated, not for Priya's room, not for 4C at all. A rapid response call, main building, first floor, the lobby, floor. Nora stepped into the hallway and heard the overhead announcement, the flat, clipped, hospital-wide tone that meant something was happening that required immediate medical response. And then she heard, underneath it, coming from the stairwell at the end of the hall, a sound that didn't belong in any normal category of hospital sounds. It came in fast, close together. 3 distinct crashes in rapid sequence, the kind of noise that a building made when something structural happened to it, or when a large number of people moved suddenly in the same direction, and under it, rising, the kind of human sound that was not screaming exactly, but was the precursor to screaming, the undifferentiated vocalization of a crowd encountering something wrong. Then the fire alarm went off. Not a drill tone, the real one. Diane appeared at the nurse's station looking at the hallway ceiling as if the ceiling could tell her something. What the hell? The overhead PA system activated, and the voice on it was the hospital operator, and the operator's voice was controlled but audibly working to stay that way. Code Orange, main atrium. Code Orange, main atrium. All available clinical staff report to emergency triage positions. This is not a drill. Code Orange. Mass casualty event. The building shook. Not dramatically. Not the way buildings shook in movies. A single, definitive concussion that moved through the floor and the walls and every person's chest simultaneously. The kind of physical fact that bypassed cognitive processing and hit something more basic. Nora was already moving. She was through the stairwell door before the echo of it had finished. She took the stairs at a controlled run, not reckless, but fast, with the particular economy of someone who had moved through bad situations before and understood that falling now was not an option. She could hear voices below her, people moving in multiple directions, and she could smell, faintly, something that had not been in the air 30 seconds ago. She came through the ground floor door into the main corridor and stopped for 1 second. The atrium at the front of the hospital, the large, glass-roofed entry space that she had walked through every morning for 4 years, was in partial structural collapse. Not total. The front section of the glass roof had come down, and the scaffolding from a renovation project on the exterior facade had pulled sections of the entryway ceiling with it. There were people on the floor. There were people standing, moving, some of them trying to help, and some of them simply frozen. There was dust in the air and the specific sound of glass and material settling. She was counting as she moved, 7 people down that she could see. More she couldn't yet. The scaffolding collapse had happened during the morning visiting window, which meant the atrium had been populated with visitors, early arriving staff, and at least one patient transport she had seen being wheeled toward discharge when she'd come down for the board meeting 2 hours ago. The hospital's emergency response team was activating. She could see the colored vests of the incident command personnel emerging from the administrative corridor. But activation took time, and in the gap between the event and the organized response, there was a period of unstructured chaos that was the most dangerous interval. She crossed the lobby. The first person she reached was a man in his 50s, sitting against the far wall with his hand pressed to his head. The blood was coming from above his eyebrow. Scalp laceration. Significant bleeding because scalp wounds always bled significantly, but the location and his level of consciousness suggested non-critical. "Can you hear me?" she said. "Yes." His voice was thick but present. "What's your name?" "David." "David, I'm a nurse. I need you to keep pressure here." She guided his hand. "Press hard. Don't move." She moved on. The protocol for mass casualty triage was not the protocol for individual patient care. She knew this in her body, not just her mind. Knew it the way you know things that have been tested under conditions that hospitals didn't test. You didn't stop at the first critical patient you found and work them until they were stable. You moved through the field, you categorized, you used the START system, simple triage and rapid treatment, and you made the calls that felt brutal and were actually the difference between maximum lives saved and maximum lives lost. She was doing it before she had consciously decided to do it. Moving, assessing, categorizing, a woman unconscious, breathing, no visible traumatic injury, possible concussion, monitor, a teenage boy with a compound fracture of the forearm, crying, alert, serious but not immediately life-threatening, move on. An elderly woman on her side, not breathing. She checked pulse, checked airway, turned her, found the airway clear, breathing resumed, positioned her, and moved. The incident commander was a man named Dale Forsyth, the hospital's emergency preparedness director, who arrived in his orange vest 40 seconds after Nora and who stopped when he saw her moving through the atrium with the systematic efficiency of someone running a protocol he recognized. "Who are you?" he said, not accusingly. He just needed to know. "Nora Voss, floor nurse, 4C, Army medical background." He looked at her for half a second, then, "Take the Eastern Quadrant. Give me a verbal count when you've tagged everyone." "Understood." She moved east. What she found in the eastern section of the atrium, beneath a section of fallen scaffolding, was a situation that moved the entire event into a different category. There were 3 people under or partially under the scaffolding. One of them was a woman she recognized, a hospital administrative assistant named Greta, early 40s, who walked through the atrium every morning on her way to the second floor. Greta's left leg was pinned under a section of aluminum scaffolding tubing. She was conscious. She was trying not to show how much pain she was in and failing. The second person was a man she didn't know, unconscious, with a visible depressed skull fracture on the right temporal area. She checked his airway, found it compromised, repositioned him, found a pulse that was present but thready. She tagged him critical and called it across the atrium to Forsyth. The third person was behind the scaffolding section, partially obscured. She moved the debris, a section of aluminum tubing she shifted with both hands, the weight of it real and unglamorous, and found a child. A girl, maybe 8 years old, in a yellow jacket. She was lying on her side. She was not moving. Nora knelt. Airway, clear. Breathing, present. Pulse. Present but irregular. She ran her hands over the child without moving her, assessing by touch and observation for the things you couldn't see from above. The child's head was positioned oddly relative to her neck. Not impossible, not definitive, but the kind of angle that meant you did not move a child until you had ruled out cervical involvement or until the alternative was worse. The child opened her eyes. Not all the way. just enough. Hey, Nora said. She kept her voice the same as it always was, calm, level, present. I've got you. You're okay. Can you tell me your name? The girl's mouth moved. Nothing came out at first. Then, Lily. Lily, I'm Nora. I'm going to stay right here with you. Don't try to move, okay? Just talk to me. My dad, Lily said. Her voice was the voice of a child trying very hard to be brave and not quite making it. Nora looked around the immediate area. No adult in visible proximity who could be the girl's father. We're going to find him, she said. Right now, I need you to keep looking at me. My neck hurts. I know. I'm going to make sure you're protected. She looked up, scanning for resources. She needed a cervical collar. She needed a backboard. She needed at least 2 more people. She raised her voice. I need a C-collar and board at the eastern wall. Now! Across the atrium, she heard Forsyth relay the call. The child's eyes were tracking. That was good. That was the most important immediate sign. Lily, Nora said, what's your favorite color? A pause. Then, faintly, yellow. That's a good choice. She kept her hand close to Lily's head, not touching it, just present in the girl's peripheral vision. Is that why you're wearing yellow today? My mom picked it. Your mom has good taste. The caller arrived, carried by a young ER tech she didn't know, who had clearly run from somewhere. Nora took it and began the process of fitting it with the controlled steadiness of someone who had done this before in conditions that made this atrium look manageable, while around her the Code Orange response was assembling into something that looked gradually more like organized response and less like chaos. Across the lobby, she could see Ben Harlow working on a patient with a chest wound, and she registered this and noted that he was doing it correctly and moved her attention back to Lily. She could also see, at the edge of her vision, Thomas Aldrich. He was standing at the edge of the incident command position in his uniform, speaking with Forsyth. She didn't know how long he had been there. He had still been in the building after the board meeting, she knew that. He was not in the way. He was observing, and as she watched, he said something to Forsyth, and Forsyth nodded and got on his radio. Then Aldrich looked across the atrium. He found her immediately, the way people found the thing that was the center of a situation, and he looked at her for one long moment, at her hands on the cervical collar, at the child on the ground, at the way she was working, and his expression was the expression of someone watching something they already knew about and finding, in the actual scene of it, that knowing and seeing were not the same thing. She looked away and focused on Lily. Okay, she told the girl. I'm going to ask you to be very brave for the next few minutes. Can you do that? Is it going to hurt? The moving might be uncomfortable. I'm going to make sure your neck is protected the whole time. You won't be alone for any part of it. Lily looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a child who was deciding whether to trust the information she was being given. Okay, Lily said. They began. The next 40 minutes were the kind of 40 minutes that compressed into memory as a series of images rather than a sequential account. The way significant time always compressed, because the mind couldn't hold all of it in order. Lily was stabilized and transferred to the ER team with the cervical collar in place and Nora's verbal handoff covering every finding in under 60 seconds. The man with the depressed skull fracture was en route to the OR. Greta's leg had been freed from the scaffolding. It took 4 people and 12 minutes, and she had not cried until afterward, which was its own kind of courage. The final count was 22 people injured in the atrium collapse. 11 required hospital admission. 2 were critical. None were dead. The scaffolding failure had been caused by a connection point on the exterior renovation structure that had sheared under load. A structural error in the renovation contractor's installation that would generate its own investigation and its own documentation and its own institutional consequences, but that was a different story for a different day. Nora was at the triage station in the corridor outside the atrium when Forsyth found her. He was a compact man in his 50s who moved like someone used to moving efficiently, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her with the direct assessment of someone who had spent his career evaluating emergency response. "Eastern Quadrant," he said. "You ran it." "I was the first one there." The child with the cervical presentation. "Lily," She's in the ER. They'll do imaging. He nodded. The man with the TBI is in surgery. They got to him because you called the level correctly. She didn't say anything. Where did you train? He asked. It was the same question Diane had asked her in her first week on 4C, and she gave him the same first line of the answer. Army. He nodded slowly, the way people nodded when something confirmed a hypothesis they'd already formed. Forsyth. She said his name to get his attention before he moved on. The triage protocol. Is this hospital running regular mass casualty drills? A pause. Annually. The response time to organized incident command today was 4 minutes and 12 seconds from the event. That's long. He looked at her. We hit our benchmark. Your benchmark is based on drills. Drills don't have the noise and the confusion and the people who freeze. She held his gaze. I'm not criticizing what you did today. I'm telling you that 4 minutes is a long window in a real event. He was quiet for a moment. Is that coming from somewhere specific? He said. Yes. The Army program that brought the general here. She didn't answer, which was itself an answer. He looked at her for another moment, with the expression of someone filing information in a prominent place. Then he said, I'd like to have a conversation about that, when this is over. All right. She went back to work. Taste. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon when the atrium was fully cleared and the acute response had transitioned to ongoing care management, and Nora finally sat down in the break room on 4C with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a granola bar she had pulled from her bag, and she ate half of it and stared at the wall. Her hands were steady. They were always steady, which was a thing she had never been entirely sure how to feel about. The biological fact of her own nervous system's response to stress, which was to quiet rather than amplify. It was useful. It was also occasionally isolating because the people around her in high-stress situations often needed to see some version of the distress they were feeling reflected back, and she couldn't give them that. She felt things. She just felt them on a delay, in private, in the flat quiet of moments like this one. She thought about Lily. She thought about the 40 minutes in the atrium and the specific decision points in them. The man with the TBI, the moment she had assessed Lily and made the call to immobilize rather than move, the way Harlow had handled the chest wound across the room better than she might have expected. She thought about what Forsyth had said. 4 minutes is a long window. She thought about the Meridian program and the 11 weeks in Dalton's email and the sentence about what she was carrying alone. She was still thinking about it when the break room door opened and Thomas Aldrich walked in. He was still in uniform. He had a cup of coffee from the machine in the hallway that looked like it was about as good as hers. He sat down across from her without asking if that was all right, because they were past the point where that was a question. The child, he said. How is she? No spinal injury on imaging, concussion, she'll be okay. He nodded, drank his coffee, made no comment about the taste of it. You ran that triage, he said. I was the first qualified person in the Eastern Quadrant. I know. He set the cup down. I watched you work for about 20 minutes before the scene was contained enough for me to move through it. She looked at the table. Nora. He used her given name, which he did rarely. The program needs what you just did in that atrium, not a version of it, not a trained approximation. That specific thing, the way you move through a scene, the way you triage, the way you talk to the child while you're maintaining clinical assessment. He paused. That's not in any manual we have. That's what we're trying to build. I know, she said. And? She looked up. I called Dalton from the atrium, she said, during a moment when Forsyth had the scene command and I had a minute. Aldrich was very still. I told her yes, Nora said. He held her gaze for a long moment, something in his face that was not quite relief and not quite pride, something older and more specific than either. Good, he said. There's a condition. Tell me. Hargrove gets included in the first training cohort. She held his eyes. This hospital needs it. Today showed me the gap. If I'm helping build this thing, I want the people I'm leaving behind to have access to it. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his coffee cup. Then he looked back at her with the expression of someone making a decision that had already effectively been made. "Done," he said. She nodded. "When do I start?" she asked. He opened his mouth to answer, and that was when both their phones went off simultaneously, hers from 4C and his from a number she couldn't see. And the sound of the overhead PA came through the break room walls, and the voice on it said 3 words that moved everything into a different register entirely. Code Red, ICU. She was already standing, but what stopped her at the door, what made her turn back for one fraction of a second, was the expression on Aldrich's face as he looked at his phone. It was not the expression of someone receiving news about a hospital emergency. It was the expression of someone receiving news from somewhere else entirely. His eyes came up and found hers, and what was in them was something she hadn't seen on his face in all the years she'd known him. "Nora," he said, "there's a situation." "Not here." The way he said it, the weight of it, said "not here." "What kind of situation?" she said. He looked at the phone, then at her. "The kind," he said. "That's why we needed you on that list." She went to the ICU first. That was the order of it. Code Red meant a patient in immediate crisis, and whatever Aldrich's phone was telling him existed in a different timeline from the one she was standing in, and the one she was standing in had a person in the ICU who needed someone to respond. She took the stairs again. 3rd floor. She came through the ICU doors at a controlled run and found the code already in progress in Bay 6, a 60-year-old man named Arthur Pell, who had been admitted overnight for a post-cardiac event and who had gone into ventricular fibrillation 4 minutes ago. And the team on him was capable and organized and didn't need her as a primary responder, which she assessed in approximately 8 seconds and then positioned herself at the edge of the bay where she could see everything and be used if needed without being in the way. The code ran 11 more minutes. Arthur Pell came back. Not cleanly. His rhythm after the 3rd shock was unstable for 90 seconds, that were the kind of 90 seconds that aged people, but it organized into a sinus rhythm with aberrant conduction that the intensivist, a woman named Dr. Amara Solis, managed with medication adjustment while the team held position. When it was over and Solis had the situation in hand, Nora stepped back into the corridor. Aldrich was waiting outside the ICU doors. He had not come up during the code. He had waited. She noted this and added it to her existing understanding of who he was. "Tell me," she said. He looked at the corridor, at the nurses moving past, the distance to the nearest open door. "Not here." They found an empty consultation room, the second one she'd used with him in 2 days, and he closed the door. He put his phone on the table face up and showed her the message. It was from someone she didn't know, a name she didn't recognize, a rank she did. The message was short and used the kind of shorthand that told her the sender and recipient had communicated this way before, in a context where brevity was not a stylistic choice, but a necessity. She read it once and understood it. There was a federal building in Columbus, 47 miles from Crestfield. It was a Department of Health and Human Services regional office, 12 floors, roughly 800 occupants on a standard workday. 40 minutes ago, a chemical exposure event had been reported on floors 7 through 9. The nature of the exposure was still being assessed. What was known was that people were symptomatic, that the building's ventilation system had been shut down as a precautionary measure, and that Columbus Fire's hazmat team was on scene, but that the casualty count was climbing faster than the initial assessment had suggested. 63 people symptomatic, 14 critical, 2 hospitals in Columbus already receiving. And the Meridian program's first operational deployment, intended to be a training exercise in 8 weeks, a controlled scenario, had just been activated early as a real event, because the DoD had 3 assets with mass casualty medical experience within driving range of Columbus, and one of them was currently standing in a hospital in Crestfield, Ohio. "They're asking if you can deploy," Aldrich said. "Not ordering, asking." She looked at the message again. The casualty distribution, the symptom descriptions in the second paragraph. Coughing, eye irritation, some neurological presentation in the critical cases, the reference to the ventilation system. "What's the exposure agent?" she said. Not confirmed. The building uses an industrial HVAC cleaning protocol with a contractor who was on site this morning. They think it's a chemical combination, so solvent-based, possibly reactive with the building's existing system chemistry, not deliberate. But the neurological presentation in the criticals is what's concerning them? Yes. She thought about what she knew about chemical exposure cascades, about how the difference between a solvent exposure and an organophosphate exposure changed everything about the treatment protocol, and how you managed a scene where you didn't yet know which one you were dealing with, and how the tendency in those situations was to err toward the more aggressive treatment assumption, which carried its own risks. She thought about the 14 critical cases and what critical meant at hour 1 of a chemical exposure event before the agent was identified. I need PPE rated for chemical exposure, she said, whatever the Columbus team has on site. Dalton is already sourcing it. There's a vehicle outside in 20 minutes. I need to hand off my patients. I know. She looked at him. Hargrove comes first in the training cohort. We already agreed to that. I want it in writing before I get in that vehicle. Something crossed his face. Not irritation, something closer to respect that had found an additional reason to exist. Dalton will have it ready. She went to find Diane. The handoff took 9 minutes, which was longer than she wanted and shorter than it should have been, and she was honest with Diane about the gap between those two things. Priya Agarwal in 414, she said. The post-appy. Dr. Harlow ordered imaging, but I don't know if it's been reviewed yet. The fever was 100.4 and trending. She needs someone keeping eyes on that number. I'll take her myself, Diane said. Walter Briggs in 408 is discharge ready pending Sue's morning note. Don't let that slip. He's been here long enough. Okay. The admission in 411, the post-knee replacement, Mrs. Daly, she's not telling anyone how much pain she's actually in. She's been undertreated because she keeps saying she's fine. She's not fine. Diane looked at her steadily. Where are you going? Columbus. There's a chemical exposure event. They need medical response. A pause. The Army. The program. Yes. Diane was quiet for a moment. She looked at the nurses' station, at the floor that was hers and had always been hers, at the work that never stopped being work regardless of what happened around it. Come back, Diane said. It wasn't a question or a request exactly. It was the thing people said when they meant something more complicated than the words. I'll be back, Nora said. She went downstairs. The vehicle was an unmarked federal SUV with a driver who introduced himself as Carver and said nothing else for the first 20 minutes of the drive, which suited Nora fine because she spent those 20 minutes on the phone with Kira Dalton going through everything that was currently known about the Columbus situation. The casualty count had risen to 71 symptomatic and 19 critical by the time they left Crestfield. The exposure agent was still unconfirmed, but a toxicologist from the Ohio Department of Health had arrived on scene and had provisionally identified markers consistent with a reactive chloramine compound, the kind that could form when certain cleaning agents were mixed improperly in an enclosed ventilation system. Chloramine exposure at high concentration caused respiratory distress, eye and mucous membrane irritation, and in the critical cases presenting with neurological symptoms, possible pulmonary edema leading to hypoxia. The neurological presentation isn't the agent itself, Nora said. It's downstream hypoxia. They're not being poisoned neurologically, they're being starved of oxygen. That's what the toxicologist is now saying, Dalton confirmed. The critical cases are hypoxic, not neurotoxic, which means the treatment protocol is respiratory support, not antidote management. Correct. But the Columbus hospitals are treating some of the criticals as potential neurotoxic exposure because the presentation mimicked it at intake. Nora closed her eyes briefly. They need to adjust. That is why you are in that vehicle. She wasn't being sent as a treating clinician. She didn't have hospital privileges in Columbus. She wasn't the toxicologist. She wasn't the incident commander. What she was being sent as was something that didn't have a clean title, but that the Meridian program had been designed around. The person who could read a mass casualty scene in real time and translate between the clinical reality and the command decisions, who could stand in the gap between what was happening to people and what the response infrastructure was actually doing about it. It was, she thought, looking out the window at the Ohio highway moving past, not entirely unlike what she had done in the atrium that morning. The difference was the scale and the chemistry. The vehicle moved fast. Carver drove with the efficiency of someone who had made this kind of trip before. She called Tillman from the car. He picked up on the first ring. "I heard," he said. "You're in a vehicle." "I'm in a vehicle." "Columbus." "Yes." A pause. "You said yes to the program this morning." "I said yes to the program this morning, and then the program activated 6 hours later." "That's a hell of an orientation." A brief pause that carried something. "You ready?" She looked at the highway. "I was ready 8 years ago," she said. "I just stopped for a while." He was quiet for a moment. "Voss?" "Yeah." "Good luck." She hung up and turned back to Dalton's briefing documents. She didn't think about Raymond Collar during the drive. She thought about him the following morning, which was the morning after Columbus. The Columbus event had lasted 14 hours from her arrival to the point where the scene was stood down, and the last critical patient was stable, and the toxicologist had completed his documentation, and the building was sealed pending contractor investigation. 19 critical patients, all 19 alive at stand-down. The treatment protocol adjustment had been implemented within 40 minutes of her arriving on scene, not because she had authority over the Columbus clinical teams, but because she had stood in the incident command tent with the medical director and the toxicologist and laid out the hypoxia cascade in language that made the treatment implication undeniable, and the medical director, a woman named Dr. Frances Look, who was decisive when given clarity, had made the call. None of the 19 had died. She drove back to Crestfield at 6 in the morning with Carver, who still said very little, and she went home and slept for 4 hours, and then she went back to Hargrove. The situation with Collar had moved while she was gone. She learned this in pieces over the course of the morning, the way she had learned most things at this hospital, through the texture of conversations around her, through what people said and didn't say, through the specific kind of institutional quiet that settled over a place when something consequential was happening behind closed doors. The audit findings had been finalized, not the preliminary report that had gone to the governing board, the full document, which had been completed during the 2 days Nora had been occupied with the board meeting and the atrium and Columbus. It was 53 pages. She didn't see the document itself, but she heard enough to understand its shape. The pattern that Sandra Okai had identified in the preliminary was documented in full in the final version. 6 incident reports over 4 years, filed against 5 different staff members, 3 nurses, 1 resident, 1 physician's assistant, in circumstances that followed a structural pattern identifiable enough that Okai had been able to document it as a documented practice rather than a series of isolated incidents. 4 of those 6 staff members had subsequently left the hospital. 2 were still employed in positions that represented effective lateral demotions. The governing board had received the document on the morning Nora was in Columbus. They had convened an emergency session that same afternoon. Collar's administrative leave, which had initially been framed as a precautionary measure pending the audit, was converted into a formal suspension with pay pending a termination proceeding, a distinction that mattered because one was temporary and the other was a process with a defined endpoint. The chief of trauma surgery position was posted for interim replacement. Nora heard the piece about the posting from Marcus Fielder, the third-year resident who had been in the OR on the morning of the incident, who had written the carefully passive note that had contributed to her review, and who found her in the 4C corridor at mid-morning with the expression of someone who had been working up to a conversation for some time. "I heard you were in Columbus," he said. "I was." "I also heard about the full audit." He was looking at the floor briefly, then up. "I should have said more in the original documentation." She looked at him. He was 27 and he was going to be a good doctor, she thought. Not because of his technical skills, which were solid, but because he was standing in this corridor having a conversation that was difficult for him and doing it anyway. "You said what you could say," she told him. "That's not the same as what I should have said." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment, not warmly, not coldly, honestly. Thank you for saying that. He nodded and walked back toward the elevator, and she watched him go and thought that the most useful thing that could come out of any of this was not her own vindication, but the effect it might have on people like Marcus Fielder, on the residents and nurses who learned, from watching what happened, that the calculation was different than they'd been led to believe, that it was possible to say the accurate thing and survive it. Ndet. Collar came back to the hospital once. Not to work. He didn't have clearance to be on clinical premises during the suspension, but to collect personal items from his office, which he had been told he could do during a specified window with an HR representative present. The window was Thursday afternoon, which was a day Nora was working. She didn't see him come in. She was with a patient, but she heard afterward from Diane that he had walked through the main corridor to reach the administrative elevator, and that 3 people had seen him, and that the hospital had been quiet in a way that hospitals weren't usually quiet, which was its own kind of commentary on 11 years of institutional culture. She also heard from Glenn Tartaglia, who told her with the air of a man discharging an uncomfortable obligation that Collar had asked, through his legal counsel, whether there was any possibility of a reduced action resolution, a resignation rather than a termination proceeding, which would allow him to preserve the structural form of his record while accepting the practical end of his role at Hargrove. The governing board had declined. They were proceeding with the full termination review, which was a public institutional process and which would generate documentation that would follow Collar's record in a way that a quiet resignation would not. She thought about this for a moment when Glenn told her, standing in the corridor outside his office, and she considered what she felt about it. What she felt was that it was the right institutional decision. Not because she wanted his consequences to be more severe than necessary, she didn't particularly, but because the pattern in the audit document involved people whose careers had been affected, some of them significantly, and the record that existed going forward needed to accurately reflect what the investigation had found. A quiet resignation would have allowed the institutional memory to be softer than the documented reality warranted. Accuracy mattered. She had always believed this. It was why she had submitted the counterstatement to the review board rather than simply accepting the transfer as the cost of an uncomfortable situation. Not pride. Accuracy. There's something else, Glenn said. He had the look of a man who kept finding more items on a list he'd hoped was finished. Tell me. 2 of the nurses who transferred out, under circumstances the audit identified. One of them is still in the region, working at Delwood Community, which is about 20 miles east. He paused. The board is reaching out to them regarding the audit findings and what remedies are available. I think you should know that's happening. She held his gaze. Their records will be reviewed. If the same pattern is present in their documentation from here, the board intends to issue formal corrections. She nodded. The weight of that was different from the weight of her own situation. Her own situation she had been able to manage, because she had the particular combination of experience and stubbornness that let her push back through formal channels without losing herself in the process. The nurses who had transferred out, who had left, they hadn't had the same leverage, or hadn't known they had it, or had been in situations where the cost of pushing back had felt too high. She didn't say any of this to Glenn. She just nodded and said, "Good," and meant it in a way that went further than the word. Bammed. She was finishing her charting at the end of Thursday's shift when her phone buzzed with a message from Dalton. Hargrove confirmed as Cohort 1, Site 1. Paperwork executed. Start date for your lead assignment, 6 weeks. You'll shadow the program director for 2 weeks prior. Locations TBD. Questions? Call me. She read it once, saved it. Then she looked up from her phone and at the nurse's station, at the dry erase board with the patient assignments, at the medication carts, at the particular fluorescent flatness of a hospital floor at end of shift when the work had been done and the next shift was coming and everything was exactly what it was, ordinary and essential and completely uncinematic. Diane was across the station writing in a chart. She looked up. "You have that look," Diane said. "What look?" "The one where you're processing something you're not going to explain for another 3 days. Nora put the phone in her pocket. The Meridian program confirmed Hargrove for its first training cohort. Diane's pen stopped. "And my start date is in 6 weeks, Nora added. Diane looked at her for a long moment. So you're leaving? In 6 weeks? But you got us into the program. Yes. Another long look. Then Diane set down her pen and did something she had not done in Nora's entire time on 4C. She crossed the station and stood directly in front of her and said, quietly and without performance, That matters. What you did for this floor, for this hospital, that matters. Nora held her gaze. You run a good floor, Diane. I run an understaffed floor. A well-run understaffed floor. A beat. There's a difference. Diane almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to a smile, but it got close. Then she went back to her chart, and Nora went back to hers, and the end of shift happened the way it always happened. What came 2 days later arrived without warning, which was the nature of the things that arrived without warning. She was in the hospital's main cafeteria at 7:20 in the morning. An unusual location for her, but the break room on 4C had a broken coffee machine, and she had decided the cafeteria coffee was worth the floor change, when she saw Raymond Collar. He was not in his hospital clothing. He was in street clothes, a gray jacket, no tie, the particular underdress quality of a man who had spent a decade being the most important person in a room and was currently not that. He was standing at the cafeteria entrance, looking at the room with the expression of someone who had not expected what they were looking at. He was looking at her. She held her cup and looked back. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cafeteria was mid-busy. Nurses from the overnight shift, early arriving staff, one family member eating a breakfast sandwich at a corner table with the hollow focus of someone who had been in the building too long. Collar crossed the room. He stopped 4 feet from her table, which was close enough for a conversation and far enough to signal that he hadn't decided yet what kind of conversation this was. I was told you wouldn't be on this floor at this hour, he said. Broken coffee machine upstairs. He looked at the cup in her hand. I'm here to get some things from my car, he said. I parked in the wrong lot last time. She nodded. He didn't leave. He stood there with the specific discomfort of a man who had something to say and had not prepared it in the way he prepared most things. I read the audit document, he said. The board made it available through my counsel. Okay. The section about the other staff members. He stopped, started again. I told myself at the time, when I filed those reports, that I was maintaining standards, that there were legitimate clinical concerns. He looked at the table rather than at her, reading the pattern, seeing all of them together. A pause that cost him something visible. It didn't look like standards. She waited. It looked like something else, he said. She held her cup. What do you want me to say to that? He looked up. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, she said, because it's not all right, and telling you it was would be dishonest, and I don't do that. She kept her voice the same temperature it always was. But I also think you know that. I think that's why you're standing here. He held her gaze. He was 53 and he looked, this morning, older than that. What happened in that OR, he said. You were right, about the patient. Yes. I knew it, at the time, I think. He said the last 2 words with the precision of a man doing honest accounting. Or I should have known it. Yes, she said again. Does that... He stopped. She looked at him steadily. I stopped being angry about that a long time ago. I told you in the hallway afterward, and I meant it. You were wrong about what you couldn't see. You couldn't see what I was. A brief pause. Now you can. He stood with that for a moment. The nurses who left, he said. The ones the board is contacting. Yes. I don't know how to... He stopped, didn't finish it. That's between you and them, she said. Not me. He nodded. He was not going to get absolution here, and he seemed to have understood that before he walked over. What he had come for was less than that and more honest. Just the fact of a conversation, just saying the things out loud, just being seen by the person who had the most reason to look away. He straightened slightly. I heard about Columbus. Yes? 19 critical, all of them alive. Yes. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, You were always more than a floor nurse. It was meant as recognition. She received it as what it was. I know, she said. He left. She drank her coffee. It was not a perfect ending to anything. It was the unresolved middle of an ongoing institutional process, and Collar still had a termination review pending, and the nurses he had displaced still had complicated situations ahead of them, and none of the people who had been hurt by the pattern in that document got those years back. She was clear-eyed about all of that. But something had been seen that had previously been unseen. That was real. That was the thing that was actually different now. She finished her coffee and went back upstairs. She had patience. And then, 5 days later, there was one more thing. The thing she had not anticipated. The thing that arrived in the form of a certified letter from the DOD that Dalton had told her to expect regarding her official service record now that the Cardin Valley operation was moving toward declassification. She opened it in her apartment, standing at the kitchen counter at 9 in the evening. It was not what she had expected. It was not just a notification of declassification. It was a letter from the Office of the Army Chief of Staff, an office she had never had direct correspondence with in 8 years of service, informing her that the Army was initiating a formal review of her service record with the intent to recommend her for a decoration that her commanding officer at the time had submitted a recommendation for, and which had been classified along with the operation itself, and which had therefore never been awarded. She read the letter twice. The recommended decoration was the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military honor the Army could award. She set the letter on the counter. She stood in her kitchen in the quiet, and for the first time in a very long time, in the privacy of her own apartment, with no one watching, with no floor to manage, and no patient to assess, and no room to hold herself steady for, she let the weight of it land. It landed. She stood there and let it. Then her phone rang. Unknown number, Ohio area code, different from the others. She looked at it, let it ring twice more, picked it up. "Voss?" she said. The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, and it was shaking in the particular way that voices shook when the person speaking had been through something that had only recently ended. "Is this the nurse?" the woman said. "From the hospital? The one who was in the atrium?" Nora went still. "This is Nora Voss," she said. "Who is this?" "My name is Janet Osei," the woman said. "My daughter was in the atrium, the little girl in the yellow jacket." Nora's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "I've been trying to get your name for 4 days," Janet said. "The hospital kept saying they couldn't give out staff information." "That's correct," Nora said. "How did you get this number?" A brief pause. "A man called me a few hours ago. He said you'd be getting a letter tonight and that I should call." Nora looked at the letter on the counter. Tillman, she thought. Of course it was Tillman. "How is Lily?" she said. The sound on the other end of the phone was the sound of a mother who had been holding something in for 4 days and had just been given permission to put it down. "She's home," Janet said. "She's okay. She keeps asking about you." A pause. "She says you told her yellow was a good choice." Nora looked at the letter, at her kitchen, at the ordinary specific reality of where she was. "It is," she said. She stayed on the phone with Janet Osei for 22 minutes. Not because there was that much to say. There wasn't, in the practical sense. Lily was home. Lily was okay. The imaging had cleared, the concussion was mild, and the neck soreness was resolving. The medical facts were clean. What kept the conversation going was something different. The thing that happened when someone had almost lost something and then hadn't and needed, for reasons that went beyond logic, to talk to the person who had been there. Janet talked about the morning of the atrium collapse. She had dropped Lily off at the hospital entrance. Lily's grandmother was on the 3rd floor recovering from a knee replacement, and Janet had been running late for work, and she had watched Lily walk through the automatic doors and then driven away, and had been 2 blocks gone when she heard what sounded like a concussion of air against the car windows, and had not understood what it was until her phone rang 4 minutes later. 4 minutes, Janet said. "That's how long I drove without knowing." Nora listened. "And then I couldn't get in," Janet said. "They had the entrance cordoned. I stood outside for 40 minutes before someone told me she was in the ER and she was stable." "That's the right protocol," Nora said, "keeping the entrance clear." I know it's the right protocol. A pause. It was still the worst 40 minutes of my life. Yes, Nora said. It would be. She didn't say anything reassuring and false. She didn't say, but it worked out, because Janet knew it had worked out, and the knowing didn't make the 40 minutes smaller. When they hung up, Janet said she would like to come to the hospital. Not for any formal reason, just to say thank you in person. Nora told her that wasn't necessary. Janet said she understood that it wasn't necessary and that she wanted to do it anyway. Nora said, okay. She set the phone down and looked at the letter on the counter again. The Distinguished Service Cross. She had never thought about military decorations the way some people thought about them. As validations, as measures of worth, as the thing that made the thing you did real. What she had done in the Cardon Valley had been real while she was doing it, without anyone deciding to recognize it afterward. The recognition didn't change the wait. It didn't change the 40 minutes. But it changed something. She was honest enough to admit that. It changed the public record. It changed what the story looked like when other people read it. And the people who had dismissed her here, the incident report, the transfer, the 11 years of institutional culture that Collar had built around his own certainty, they had made their assessments based on a record that had been incomplete by design. Not her design. The Army's design, for reasons that had been valid and were now resolved. The record was about to be complete. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and went to bed. The termination hearing for Raymond Collar was scheduled for a Tuesday, which Nora noted with the particular irony of someone who paid attention to dates. She was not required to attend. She was not a party to the proceeding in any formal sense. The termination action belonged to the institution, not to the individuals whose experiences had been documented in the audit. She had submitted a written account of her own case when asked by the board's legal team, and that account was part of the record, and her attendance in the room was not necessary for the record to speak. She attended anyway. Not out of satisfaction. She had examined that motivation carefully and found it insufficient. But because the two nurses who were still employed at Hargrove, the ones who had transferred off the trauma floor under circumstances the audit had identified, were attending, and she thought it mattered that someone be present who understood the full shape of what the proceeding was doing. Their names were Angela Brewer and Tom Seawald. She had met them once each, briefly, in the days after the audit went public. Brief hallway conversations that had the careful quality of people who weren't sure yet whether they were in the same story. Angela was 41, a trauma nurse who had been moved to outpatient services 18 months ago after filing an internal concern about surgical protocol and receiving, 6 days later, a performance review that had described her as resistant to direction in language that now read very differently in the context of the audit findings. Tom was 34, a PA who had transferred to the urgent care satellite clinic voluntarily, he said, though the sequence of events documented in his file suggested the voluntary nature of that transfer had been significantly shaped by pressure. The three of them sat in the same row at the back of the board meeting room. The hearing took 90 minutes. It was like most institutional processes, less dramatic in execution than in consequence. There were documents. There was testimony from the audit director, Sandra Okai, who presented her findings in the precise and unsentimental language of someone who had spent a career doing this and understood that the precision was what made it impossible to dismiss. There was a statement from the board's legal counsel regarding the specific violations of hospital conduct policy documented in the audit. There was a response from Collar's attorney, which made several arguments that the record didn't support, and which the board chair, Roberta Finch, received with the particular patience of someone who had read the document and had already reached her conclusions. Collar himself said very little. He sat at the far end of the table, not the position of authority he had occupied for 11 years, but a chair at the edge of the proceeding, the position of someone who was there to be addressed rather than to direct. And he looked at the table more than he looked at the room, and he answered the questions put to him directly and without elaboration. At one point, Finch asked him, for the record, whether he disputed the pattern of conduct documented in the audit. A pause. "No," he said, "I don't dispute the findings." The room was quiet. Finch looked at her notes. "Is there anything you want to add before the board deliberates?" Another pause. Longer. "I want it on record," he said, "that the clinical care in the trauma department was not compromised by my conduct. The outcomes? Dr. Collar. Finch's voice was not unkind, but it was final. The board's assessment addresses conduct, not outcomes. Those are documented separately. Is there anything about the conduct findings you want to address? He looked at the table. No, he said. The board deliberated for 38 minutes. The decision was unanimous. Termination of his position as Chief of Trauma Surgery and attending physician at Hargrove Memorial Hospital, effective immediately. Formal referral of the conduct findings to the Ohio State Medical Board for review of his licensures. Not a revocation, which was not within the hospital board's authority, but a referral that would initiate a separate process with its own timeline and its own consequences. His privileges at Hargrove were revoked. His name would be removed from the departmental records where it appeared in a leadership capacity. The 2 nurses and 1 physician's assistant whose transfers had been documented as conduct-related would have their personnel files corrected, and the hospital would engage in a formal conversation with each of them about remedies for the professional impact of those transfers. Finch read the decision aloud into the record. The room was quiet when she finished. Nora looked at Angela Brewer, who was sitting to her left. Angela was looking at the table. Her jaw was set and her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were the eyes of someone doing the work of feeling something significant without letting it become unmanageable in a public room. Nora didn't say anything. She put her hand briefly on the table between them, not touching Angela's hands, just placing it there, present, in the peripheral vision of the woman next to her. Angela's jaw unclenched slightly. That was enough. Well, outside the meeting room in the corridor, Tom Seiwald stopped and leaned against the wall and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. 18 months, he said. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. I know, Nora said. I almost didn't come back from the clinic. He looked at her. I liked the work there. I told myself that was why I stayed. Maybe it was. Maybe. He pushed off the wall. The formal correction they mentioned, for our files. They'll do it, Nora said. I'll follow up if they don't. He looked at her, at the flatness and the certainty of that statement, and nodded once. Okay. Angela had been quiet through this exchange. Now she said, I heard about Columbus. Yes. And the program. That Hargrove is the first site. Yes. Angela looked at her directly. What you said in your written account for the board, the part about accuracy. She paused. I read it. Finch shared the submitted statements with us before the hearing. Nora waited. You wrote that the record needed to be accurate because the people who had been affected by inaccuracy deserved an accurate account, not just a favorable one. Angela held her gaze. I've been thinking about that phrase, the difference between accurate and favorable. They're not the same thing, Nora said. No. A pause. But you fought for accurate, not favorable, and the accurate version happened to also be the one that was fair to you. Yes. That doesn't always happen. No, Nora agreed. It doesn't. They stood in the corridor for a moment, 3 people who had each been on the receiving end of the same institutional machinery and who were now standing on the other side of it, in the aftermath, which was its own kind of strange. Thank you, Angela said. Simply. Without the weight that could have been in it, but also without pretending the weight wasn't there. Nora nodded. She went back to 4C. Well, her last day at Hargrove Memorial Hospital was a Thursday in late April. 6 weeks from the day Dalton had confirmed the program, almost to the day, which was not a coincidence because Dalton was not a person who dealt in coincidences. The day was ordinary. That was what she had wanted and what she had said when Diane had asked, 2 weeks earlier, whether she wanted anything particular for the transition. Ordinary. Shifts, patients, the work itself. She had 4 patients. Walter Briggs had long since been discharged. She had heard from Diane that he'd sent a fruit basket to the nurses' station, which was exactly the kind of thing he would do. Priya Agarwal's fever had resolved without further surgical intervention, the imaging having confirmed a minor inflammatory response that antibiotics had managed cleanly. The work had been what the work always was, unglamorous and essential and conducted in the spaces between the things that made the news. She did her morning assessments. She caught a medication timing error in a chart. Not dangerous, but worth correcting, and she corrected it. She sat for 12 minutes with a 63-year-old man named Frank, who was terrified of his upcoming discharge because his wife had died 2 months ago, and going home to an empty house was a different problem than any clinical problem she could address. And she sat with him and didn't pretend that she could fix it and didn't leave before it felt right to leave. At 3 in the afternoon, Diane called the floor staff together at the nurses' station. It was not a formal gathering, no speeches, no cake, nothing that would have made Nora uncomfortable. It was just the people who were on shift standing in the station, and Diane saying, with the directness that was the only register Diane really operated in, "Nora leaves today for the Meridian program. She's the reason Hargrove is the first training site. I want that said out loud." A brief pause. "She's also the best nurse who has ever worked on this floor," Diane continued, "and I've been here 6 years, so I've seen a few." Someone started to applaud. It was Ben Harlow, who had been moving through 4C consulting on a patient and had stopped at the edge of the station. He started it, and other people joined, and it lasted maybe 15 seconds, which was long enough. Nora looked at the station, at the dry erase board, and the medication cart, and the overhead light that had been flickering since January, and that facilities had promised to fix 3 times. And she felt the specific attachment of someone leaving a place that had required a lot of them and to which they had given it. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it was the true thing, "Take care of this floor." She meant it for all of them. She meant it most for Diane. Diane met her eyes and nodded once, and that was the entirety of the goodbye between them, which was exactly right. Janet Osei came that afternoon. She arrived at 4:15 with Lily beside her, a small girl in a blue jacket this time, not yellow, though Nora noticed the yellow sneakers, which seemed deliberate. Lily had a bandage behind her left ear from the laceration she'd sustained in the collapse. Otherwise, she looked like a child, wide-eyed and curious and slightly solemn, with the particular solemnity of kids who have been through something and have been told by the adults around them that it was significant. They met in the family waiting area near the main entrance. Lily looked at Nora for a moment, then she said, "You're shorter than I thought." Janet made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "I get that a lot," Nora said. "You didn't seem short." Lily was assessing her with the frankness of an 8-year-old. "When you were next to me, you seemed tall." "That's how it works sometimes." Lily appeared to find this satisfactory. Then she said, "You held your hand close to my face." "I remember." "You didn't touch me. You just kept it there." "So you could see it," Nora said. "So I could see it," Lily repeated. She seemed to be deciding what that meant. "My teacher said that when she's scared, she looks for something that's not moving, to help her stop feeling scared. That's a good strategy." "Were you scared?" Lily asked. The question landed with the directness that children's questions always had. Nora thought about the honest answer. "I was focused," she said, "which is what I do instead of scared." Lily considered this. "Is that something you can learn?" "Yes," Nora said. "It takes a while, but yes." Lily nodded as if this was a piece of information she was filing for later use. Janet had been watching this exchange with the expression of a mother watching her child navigate something the mother couldn't do for her. When Lily moved to look at something across the room, Janet turned to Nora. "She keeps talking about your voice," Janet said quietly. "She says you sounded like nothing was wrong." "Something was wrong," Nora said. "I know, that's what I mean." Janet looked at her directly. "Thank you. For what you did, and for how you did it, both things mattered." Nora held her gaze. "She did everything right. She stayed still. She talked to me. She made it easy." Janet smiled, a tired smile, the kind that lived close to tears. "She's going to talk about this for years." "She should," Nora said. "It was something she went through. She came out the other side. That's worth talking about." Lily came back with the news that there was a vending machine that had gummy bears, a detail she delivered with the emphasis of someone who felt it was germane to the overall situation. They said goodbye in the way people said goodbye when there was a lot underneath the words, and everyone understood that the words were only the surface. Lily hugged her, briefly, firmly, with the uncomplicated physical certainty of children. Then they were gone, and Nora stood in the lobby of Hargrove Memorial Hospital, for a moment, alone. And the early evening light was coming through the new glass panels where the atrium ceiling had been repaired. Clean panels, clear, the scaffolding structure outside rebuilt under a different contractor with a new inspection certification. And the light was flat and institutional and still carried something. She picked up her bag. She walked out. Bah. The Meridian program's first official gathering was held in a federal facility in Columbus 3 days later, a building she had been in under different circumstances 6 weeks prior, which the program's logistics coordinator seemed unaware of, and which Nora didn't mention. There were 11 people in the room. She was the last to arrive, which was unusual for her and was the result of a highway delay she had not accounted for. And she came through the door to find 10 people already seated at a long table and Thomas Aldrich standing at the front of the room looking at the door in the specific way of a man who has been watching it for 3 minutes. She sat down. She looked at the people at the table, at the faces, each of them carrying the particular quality of someone who had done something real and significant in conditions that most people never encountered, and who had afterward gone back to ordinary life and kept doing the work. She recognized it because she saw it in mirrors. Tillman was there. Of course he was there. He was at the far end of the table, and he looked at her when she came in with an expression that said exactly nothing, which was his version of telling her everything. She looked back at him the same way. Aldrich moved to the front of the room. Meridian started as a bureaucratic idea, he said. Emergency preparedness program for civilian medical facilities, training framework, response protocol. He looked at the table. What it became, what it is something you can't generate from a bureaucratic idea. It became this because of the people in this room, because of what each of you did in the field, and because you were willing to bring that back. He paused. We're not here to be remembered, he said. We're here because the next mass casualty event is going to happen in a hospital or near a hospital that doesn't know how to handle it. And the people who die in the gap between the event and the organized response are going to be real people. And we have the specific and hard-won knowledge to make that gap smaller. He looked around the room. That's the job. Nora looked at the table. She thought about the atrium, the 22 people, the 19 in Columbus. She thought about Dale Pruitt and Douglas Herrera and Lily in the yellow jacket. She thought about what it meant to be good at the exact thing that was needed in the exact moment it was needed, and what happened when you stopped pretending that capability was something to apologize for. She thought about Raymond Collar, who had looked at her and seen a floor nurse, and who had been categorically wrong, not because she was secretly important, but because he had decided not to look. She thought about every room where the quietest person was the most capable person, and how many of those rooms there were, and how much the difference cost when it went unseen. Aldrich handed it to the program director, and the program director began the first session, and Nora opened her folder and picked up her pen, and the work began the way all real work began, not with ceremony, not with revelation, but with the next thing that needed doing. Tim. 3 weeks into the program, the formal notification came from the Army. The ceremony was scheduled for the following month. A small one, by military standards, no parade ground, no dress formation. A room in Washington with the relevant people and the official record and the physical fact of the decoration. She called her mother from the hotel room the night before. Her mother lived in western Pennsylvania and was 71 and had the particular quality of a woman who had raised a daughter she never fully understood and had decided somewhere in her 60s that not fully understanding was not the same as not being proud. Tell me again what it's for, her mother said. For something that happened a long time ago, Nora said. In the Army. They couldn't talk about it before. And now they can. Yes. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Are you nervous? Nora considered this. No. You should be a little nervous. It's a big thing. I know it's a big thing. You always do that, her mother said. You always take big things and make them sound like they're the same size as everything else. Nora almost smiled. It's a useful habit. It's a maddening habit. A pause. I'm proud of you. I know. You could say it back. I know you're proud of me, Nora said, and I know it took a long time for both of us to understand what that meant. Her mother laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind that came from being seen accurately by someone you loved. Get some sleep, she said. You too. She slept. The ceremony was what it was. A room, an official account read into the record, a decoration presented by a person whose rank meant that the weight of the thing was institutional and real. Aldrich was there. Tillman was there. In the back. In civilian clothes, with an expression he was clearly working to keep neutral and not entirely succeeding. When it was over, Tillman found her in the corridor outside the room. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her. Cardin Valley, he said finally. Yes. You should have had this years ago. The timing was what it was. He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in the particular frustration of someone who had accepted a true thing without finding it satisfying. You carried that without the recognition for 7 years. I didn't carry it for recognition. I know. He looked at her. That's what makes it worse. She held his gaze. It makes it right, she said. The reason I went into that valley wasn't the decoration. The reason was the people. The decoration is accurate, but it's not what it was about. He was quiet. What it was about, she said, is still true, with or without the piece of metal. Tillman looked at the corridor, then back at her. You're insufferably consistent, you know that? I've been told. It's actually annoying. I know. He laughed. Not a suppressed laugh, a real one, short and genuine. The laugh of someone who had been in a drainage ditch with this person for 7 hours and had come out the other side and still couldn't quite account for the fact of it. What Nora Voss understood at 38 that she had not understood at 31 when she left the army and started over was that the version of strength she had spent her life embodying, the contained kind, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't need a room to notice it, was real strength. But it had a cost she hadn't named clearly. The cost was that when you made yourself invisible in order to function, some people mistook the invisibility for absence. And some of those people, like Raymond Collar, then built structures around their mistake and enforced them until the structures had their own momentum. She had always known, on some level, that what she was could not be hidden indefinitely, that eventually the gap between what she was assessed to be and what she actually was would be visible to someone who was looking. What she hadn't known, what she had needed to learn in a hospital in Crestfield, Ohio, in the specific combination of a scaffold collapse and a governing board and a classified record coming open in real time, was that making yourself visible was not the same as performing. That it was possible to be seen without changing who you were to accommodate the scene. She had not become a different person when Aldrich walked into Hargrove Memorial with his stars and his salute. She had not become a different person when the audit landed or the incident report was rescinded or the letter arrived from Washington. She had been that person the whole time. The woman who arrived early, who checked the supplies, who caught the things that didn't fit, who held her hand near a child's face in the rubble so the child had something that wasn't moving to look at. The record had caught up with her. That was all. And what she wanted to say, what she would say, in the months ahead, in training rooms and hospitals across Ohio, and eventually across the country, to nurses and residents and emergency responders who sat across from her with the particular wariness of people who had been in systems that taught them to make themselves small, was this. The system benefits when you make yourself small. The patients don't. You were trained. You have knowledge. You have the specific hard-won understanding that comes from being present in rooms when things go wrong. And that understanding is not your employer's. It is yours. And the day you use it to protect someone who cannot protect themselves is not the day to ask for permission first. She would also say, you will sometimes pay for it. The structure will sometimes move against you. The incident report exists. The transfer happens. The person who files it will look certain when they do it, and that certainty will feel like authority, and authority will feel like truth. It is not truth. The record is the truth. And the record, in the end, finds its way to accuracy. Not always quickly, not always without cost, not in a way that gives back everything that was taken in the interim, but accurately. She had stood in a hospital in Crestfield, Ohio, with a transfer notice in her hand and a false incident report in her file, and she had gone back upstairs and done her job. And the job had been its own argument, and the argument had eventually been heard. That was the thing she would carry into every room she walked into for the rest of her life. Not the decoration, not the program, not the governing board's apology or caller's quiet admission in the cafeteria. The thing she would carry was simpler than any of those, and older. The knowledge that what you are does not require an audience to be real, that the work is the evidence, and that the people who tell you to step back because of what they think they see, they are only ever working with incomplete information. You are the complete version. Act accordingly.